I gave my virginity to a stranger, not for love, not for money, but so he wouldn't have to marry someone he didn't love." The words echoed in Amelia Rivera's head as she stood backstage at the Manhattan Civic Hall, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and disbelief. On the large screen above her, a live broadcast of the Global Investment Summit showed Grant Sinclair stepping onto the stage, receiving thunderous applause from an audience that saw him as the symbol of American success and brilliance. He hadn't changed much over the years, still tall, poised, effortlessly commanding attention with those sharp gray eyes and the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. Yet to Amelia, he still looked like the man who once whispered broken truths into the darkness, then disappeared before sunrise, never knowing he had left more than just memories behind. In the front row of the auditorium, her 10-year-old son Oliver sat upright, small in frame but intense in presence, and as Grant began to speak, the boy slowly raised his hand. His voice was clear, a little shaky but full of purpose. "My name is Oliver Rivera, and I believe Grant Sinclair is my father." The room fell silent as the statement sliced through the air, drawing all eyes to the child who dared to speak the unthinkable. A ripple of gasps swept the hall, cameras zoomed in, reporters whispered into recorders, and for a long second, Grant stood frozen, staring at the boy with the kind of look that searched deeper than the surface. The resemblance was subtle yet undeniable, the angle of the chin, the steady gaze, even the way he didn't flinch when the whole room turned against him. It was like watching a ghost from a life Grant had tried to forget. Oliver didn't waver, didn't flinch because this wasn't impulsive. He had planned it quietly, carefully, piece by piece. Over the past year, he had uncovered the truth, not through anger or accident, but through quiet observation. He had found the old photograph buried in a keepsake box under his mother's bed, a younger Grant with softer eyes and a crooked tie. Beside it, a letter never sent, and a folded page from a newspaper dated 10 years ago, showing Grant Sinclair canceling his high-profile wedding just 2 days before the ceremony. Amelia never told him the whole story, only fragments, a name once whispered, a look of pain when asked about his father, and a story that ended too early. Oliver connected the dots, his mother's sadness, her sacrifice, the man on every magazine cover, and the strange silence that had lived in their home like a shadow. Backstage, Amelia could barely breathe as she watched her son stand in front of the most powerful man in the room and speak a truth she had spent a decade hiding. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She never wanted to see Grant again, never expected him to meet the child he had unknowingly fathered. She had built a quiet life, away from scandal, away from him. But now the curtain was pulled back, the world was watching, and her son had forced open a door she had sealed long ago. Grant finally broke his silence, his voice low but firm as he looked toward the moderators. "Bring that boy backstage." And in that moment, Amelia knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The truth had been buried for 10 years, and it was her son who chose to dig it up. 10 years earlier, the city of Las Vegas buzzed with the energy of neon lights, casino bells, and secrets whispered in hotel corridors, and somewhere between the grandeur of the Bellagio and the quiet corners of an upscale rooftop bar, 19-year-old Amelia Rivera was trying to make ends meet. She worked nights at a luxury hotel, cleaning rooms and serving cocktails, often watching the world of wealth from a careful distance. Her dreams of college buried beneath hospital bills and her mother's declining health. She had grown up fast, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, and still found time to teach her how to survive with dignity. Amelia didn't ask for much, just enough to pay for community college someday, enough to keep her mother's treatments going, enough to stay afloat in a world that never offered her a hand. That night, she was assigned to the private penthouse suite of one of the hotel's most exclusive guests, a man who had taken over the financial headlines for months, the heir to Sinclair Holdings, Grant Sinclair. He was 25 then, already a billionaire in his own name, yet his eyes carried something restless, as though even all that power had failed to bring him peace. Rumors surrounded him that his family had arranged a marriage to Miranda Chambers, the daughter of a rival conglomerate, and that the wedding would mark the largest financial merger in the country's corporate history. But those who looked closer saw the cracks beneath the polished surface, whispers of Grant's resistance, of fights behind closed doors, of a man being pushed into a life that was never his choice. That evening, as Amelia brought a tray of drinks to the suite, she found Grant sitting alone on the balcony, his tie undone, his phone turned face down, the city glowing behind him like a false promise. He looked up, not with the arrogance she expected, but with something vulnerable, tired, almost lost. She tried to turn away quickly, but he stopped her, asked her name, then asked her to sit for a moment. He spoke softly, told her the truth he could never admit to the press, that he didn't love the woman he was about to marry, that he was being forced to sign away his life in exchange for preserving his family's empire. Then, almost in a whisper, he said that if he could prove he had been with another woman before the wedding, the engagement would be legally void according to a clause in his grandfather's will. She laughed at first, thought he was joking, but his eyes were serious. A silence stretched between them, until he said one more thing, something that would stay with her for years. "You don't owe me anything, but if you help me tonight, I can help your mother tomorrow." It wasn't romantic, it wasn't charming, but it was real, and that was what made her heart ache. She could have walked away, could have pretended the moment never happened, but something in his voice reminded her of her mother's desperation, the way she used to cry silently in the hospital waiting room. So Amelia nodded, slowly, and that night she gave away something she had always imagined saving for someone she loved. Not because she was forced, not because she wanted to gain anything, but because she thought maybe, just maybe, it was the only way both of them could be free. The next morning, Grant was gone. No note, no goodbye, just a hotel room returned to silence, and a girl staring at empty sheets, wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Days later, the news broke that the Sinclair Chambers wedding was officially canceled. The public reason listed as private personal matters, and the media speculated endlessly about betrayal, secrets, and hidden scandals. Amelia watched from the hotel break room, her stomach twisting as she realized he had done exactly what he said he would, but he had left her behind without a single word. Weeks passed, and then came the moment that changed everything. A pregnancy test. Positive. She stared at the tiny blue line with numb hands, her future suddenly rewriting itself without permission. She didn't tell anyone, not her coworkers, not even her mother, at first. She simply packed what she could, left the city where no one would believe her story, and disappeared into the vast and quiet corners of California, determined to raise her child alone, even if the man who fathered him never knew his name. For the first few months in California, Amelia lived in a tiny rented room above a bakery in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Sacramento. The air smelled of cinnamon in the mornings, and the couple who owned the place never asked too many questions. She worked part-time at a local library, kept her head down, and began preparing for the child growing inside her. Not with excitement, but with a strange mix of fear and purpose. There was no time for self-pity, no space for regret, only the practical rhythm of surviving. She never looked up Grant Sinclair again, never tried to call anyone from the hotel. She told herself that if he had wanted to find her, he would have, and if he didn't, then maybe that was answer enough. When Oliver was born, the nurses kept complimenting his eyes, stormy gray and clear as winter water, the same eyes that had haunted her dreams for months. Holding him for the first time, she cried not because she was afraid, but because she had never known that something so small and fragile could make her feel whole again. She named him Oliver James Rivera, and from that moment forward, every decision she made revolved around him. She worked during the day, studied at night, finished her degree online, and by the time Oliver turned 3, she had a stable job as a junior librarian at a public school and a small apartment of her own. She never dated, not seriously, not with the kind of heart that believed in new beginnings. because a part of her still lived in that hotel room, still remembered how it felt to give herself to someone who never looked back. Oliver grew up fast, always curious, always asking questions that felt too big for his age. He loved numbers, patterns, puzzles, anything that made the world make sense. By the time he was 6, he could calculate change faster than cashiers and correct his teacher's math on the board. Amelia watched him with pride and a quiet sadness, knowing she couldn't take credit for all of it, knowing that part of him came from a man she once tried to forget. Still, she never mentioned Grant, never spoke his name. When Oliver asked about his father, she only said he was someone from a different time, someone she had once helped in a way that didn't make sense to explain. The boy seemed to accept it, though sometimes he would look at her with that same sharp gaze and say nothing, as if waiting for her to say more. It wasn't until Oliver was 9 that things began to shift. One day he came home from school, holding a worn-out book about finance and business strategy, said his teacher had recommended it after he finished the curriculum ahead of schedule. Amelia smiled, helped him read through the chapters, but her stomach twisted when she saw a full-page profile of Grant Sinclair printed near the back. The article praised his leadership at Sinclair Holdings, mentioned his mysterious absence from the spotlight a decade ago, then highlighted his return as a visionary billionaire who revolutionized sustainable investments. The photo showed him older, but not unfamiliar, the same angular face, the same intense eyes. Oliver stared at it for a long time, then said something that made Amelia freeze. "He kind of looks like me." Amelia tried to brush it off, said all CEOs look serious in magazine photos, but Oliver wasn't convinced. That night, after she went to bed, he sneaked into the living room, opened the old photo box she kept high on the closet shelf, and found the picture she had hidden for years. It was a blurry image taken from a distance, a man standing on a hotel balcony at sunrise, his back slightly turned, but the angle of his jaw was familiar. The way his hand rested against the railing looked too natural to be coincidence. Tucked behind it was a handwritten note Amelia had once scribbled and never sent. A letter to Grant she had written in the early days of her pregnancy, trying to find the courage to reach out before throwing it into the box instead. Over the next few weeks, Oliver began his own quiet investigation. He used the library computers during lunch breaks, read everything he could find about Grant Sinclair, memorized timelines, and started connecting them to the few things he knew about his own origins. When he saw an announcement for the Sinclair Foundation's Young Innovators Program, a national scholarship contest for gifted children in finance and technology, he applied without telling his mother. His submission included an essay, a proposed app for teaching kids investment skills, and a single sentence that would later capture the attention of every board member reviewing the file. "My passion for finance comes from watching the world my father helped build, even if he never knew I existed." When the acceptance letter came, Amelia was shocked. She had no idea Oliver had applied, and when she read the attached itinerary and saw that the finalists would be flown to New York for a private summit with Grant Sinclair himself, her hands began to shake. She tried to tell him they couldn't go, that it was too far, too expensive, that she had work and he had school, but Oliver looked her in the eye and said calmly, "I need to meet him, even if you're not ready." In the end, she agreed, partly because she knew she couldn't keep running forever, and partly because a small part of her needed closure just as much as he did. They arrived in New York 2 days before the summit. The city felt too loud, too fast, memories of Vegas bleeding into the present as Amelia walked the hotel hallways holding Oliver's hand. She hadn't seen Grant in a decade, hadn't spoken his name aloud since the day he left, and now she would have to breathe the same air again, pretend they were strangers while the truth pulsed beneath the surface. She told Oliver to behave, to listen, to stay close, but deep down she knew he wouldn't just sit quietly. That morning, as they arrived at the auditorium, Oliver slipped away while she filled out paperwork. By the time she noticed he was missing, he was already in the front row of the hall, watching Grant step onto the stage with the eyes of a child, looking for something more than a role model. In that moment, everything shifted. Oliver stood, raised his voice, and told the world his truth. Amelia didn't move, didn't speak, just stood frozen backstage while cameras flashed and voices erupted, and the man she once knew stared down at the boy who carried his blood. She had spent 10 years building a life from the pieces Grant left behind, and now, in one unplanned moment, it all came crashing back. Whatever happened next, Amelia knew the past could no longer be ignored, because the child she had raised with quiet strength had chosen to reveal what she had tried so hard to bury. The room fell into a strange kind of silence after Oliver's words, not the silence of confusion or discomfort, but the heavy pause that follows something impossible to ignore. Grant stood at the edge of the stage, staring at the boy with a face that was both familiar and foreign, a boy who seemed too young to speak with such certainty and too confident to be dismissed. Grant's mind was spinning as he took a breath, forcing his voice to stay calm as he requested the security team escort Oliver backstage, not as a threat, not as a reprimand, but because he needed answers that couldn't wait another second. Amelia watched it unfold from behind the curtain, her heart slamming against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She could barely move when Oliver appeared beside her, his small hand reaching for hers, not in fear, but as a gesture of reassurance. She met Grant's eyes for the first time in 10 years, and in that moment, everything inside her cracked open. There was no rage, no accusations, just the crushing weight of everything they had never said. Grant didn't speak right away, his expression unreadable, until finally he asked, not to the boy but to her, "Is it true?" She wanted to lie, wanted to protect the life she had built, but Oliver was standing between them and there was nothing left to hide. She nodded slowly, barely able to look at him as she answered, "Yes, he's yours." The words sounded small in her mouth, but they echoed through Grant like an explosion, 10 years of silence shattered by a single sentence. He asked to speak to them privately, and they were escorted to a conference room where the noise of the summit faded into background static. Grant sat across from them, his fingers laced together, and he asked for the whole story. Amelia hesitated at first, unsure whether the truth would heal or harm, but eventually she told him everything, from the night on the balcony in Las Vegas to the moment she found out she was pregnant, from the job she lost to the apartment she shared with her sick mother, to the nights she sat alone, wondering if he even remembered her name. She told him she never reached out because she thought he had chosen his path and she had no place in it. Grant listened in silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because every word she spoke painted a version of himself he didn't recognize, a man who had hurt someone without meaning to, a man who had unknowingly abandoned a child who now sat before him with the same fire in his eyes. He admitted he had looked for her once, shortly after the wedding was cancelled, but someone in his circle had told him she left town. No forwarding address, no record, just gone. He had buried that chapter out of necessity, convincing himself it was better that way, that she had made her choice and that he had no right to interfere. But now, staring at Oliver, he knew that lie had cost him something irreplaceable. He asked the boy about his life, his interests, and Oliver answered with the casual brilliance of someone who had grown up too fast. He spoke about numbers, about systems, about building things that lasted longer than people's promises, and Grant felt his chest tighten with a feeling he didn't yet know how to name. When the boy excused himself to go to the restroom, the room was left with a silence that felt heavier than before, and Grant turned to Amelia, his voice lower now, less sharp. He asked her why she never told him, really told him, and she looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes, and said simply, "Because I didn't want to be the girl who chased a billionaire with a child." Later that evening, Grant requested a private paternity test, not because he doubted the truth, but because the media would demand it, and he needed every piece of confirmation to protect the boy from what was coming. The test was done discreetly, rushed through a private lab, and the results returned in less than 24 hours. The moment he held the papers in his hands, Grant didn't feel vindicated or shocked. He felt hollow, realizing the years he had lost, the birthdays missed, the first words never heard, the scraped knees he hadn't kissed. He called a meeting with his legal team and his personal assistant, issuing new instructions to update his will, restructure his shares, and add Oliver as a direct beneficiary to the Sinclair Foundation. But he also knew it wasn't just about money or titles. It was about connection, trust, and trying to rebuild something from nothing. He asked Amelia if she would allow him to spend time with Oliver, not as a stranger trying to make up for lost time, but as a man who had learned too late what mattered most. She agreed, cautiously, watching him with eyes that still held traces of hurt. Over the next few days, Grant and Oliver spent time together in quiet corners of the city, walking through museums, sitting in parks, eating food from street vendors, talking about everything except the elephant in the room. They didn't speak about the past, not at first, because the bond forming between them didn't need explanations. Only time. Grant watched the boy solve puzzles in minutes, explain economic theories he barely remembered from college, and once, when they passed by a street performer playing violin, Oliver stopped and whispered, "Mom cries when she hears that song." And Grant realized how much he didn't know. Amelia stayed at a distance, torn between fear and hope, watching her son smile in a way she hadn't seen before, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake. But everything changed again when someone in the press leaked the story. Overnight, headlines flooded the internet, speculations exploded across tabloids and business news networks, and photos of Grant with a 10-year-old boy went viral under clickbait titles, questioning the legitimacy of his personal life. Reporters swarmed their hotel, cameras camped outside the doors, and a firestorm of opinion threatened to consume everything they had built in just a few days. Grant's publicist demanded a statement, his board called an emergency session, and his family lawyers strongly advised him to handle the situation privately, maybe even disprove the story to protect the company. But Grant refused. Standing at a press conference the next morning with Amelia and Oliver seated quietly behind him, he looked into the cameras and said with clarity and conviction, 10 years ago, I made a decision that changed my life. I walked away from something I didn't fully understand, and I've regretted it every day since. This boy is my son, and I am not ashamed of him. I am honored to know him." The backlash was immediate, mixed, and intense. Some applauded him for owning the truth, others criticized his character, and investors panicked. Grant didn't care. He had already made up his mind. Amelia watched him speak with the steadiness of a man who had nothing to lose except what mattered most. And she realized the man from 10 years ago was gone. In his place stood someone who had finally found the courage to be more than just powerful, someone trying to be present, someone trying to be a father. In the weeks that followed the press conference, the world around them changed at a pace neither Amelia nor Oliver could have predicted. Reporters circled their building like vultures, paparazzi followed them through grocery stores and school drop-offs. Even neighbors who once smiled politely now whispered behind closed blinds. As if her story was something shameful, Amelia tried to keep things normal for Oliver, but the weight of public scrutiny pressed on every quiet moment, turning privacy into a privilege they no longer had. Grant, despite having weathered scandal before, seemed unprepared for the emotional toll this one carried. Not because of the media, but because now he had something to lose that actually mattered. He held meetings with advisors in the early mornings, restructured his PR team, and cut business ties with any board member who even hinted at pushing him toward denial. He didn't hide from the story, instead he leaned into it, spoke openly about fatherhood in interviews, launched an education fund in Oliver's name, and began advocating for single mothers through the Sinclair Foundation. He asked Amelia to let them move into a more secure location, somewhere quieter, better protected, away from the noise and the scrutiny. But she hesitated, unsure whether uprooting their lives for his influence was worth the cost. She told him she wasn't looking to be saved, and he nodded, understanding finally that love, if it still lived between them, couldn't be bought or relocated. It had to be rebuilt with patience. For Oliver, the world expanded and collapsed at the same time. He was proud to be known, proud to be acknowledged, but also confused by the fame and the narrative strangers were writing about his family. He clung to his mother's hand more often, spoke less in class, and once, after a field trip where a teacher asked him to speak about his father's empire, he came home and asked her if he was still allowed to just be a kid. Amelia held him close that night, whispered that he could be anything he wanted to be, and reminded him that truth might be loud for a while, but would eventually grow quiet again. But just as the media noise began to soften, a new wave of conflict arrived in the form of Grant's father, Richard Sinclair, the patriarch of the family empire and a man known more for his control than his compassion. He requested a private meeting with Grant, which turned into a confrontation, and the message was brutally clear. If Grant continued acknowledging the child publicly, the family trust would be frozen, board seats would be revoked, and he would be effectively exiled from the legacy he had spent his entire life preparing to inherit. Richard did not believe in emotional decisions. He believed in alliances, image, and preservation, and to him Oliver was a deviation from the clean narrative he had spent years curating. Grant didn't argue. He walked out of the office and drove straight to Amelia's apartment, told her everything without dramatics, and said plainly, "They want me to choose between you and the company, and I've already made my choice." Amelia didn't respond immediately, unsure what to say to a man willing to burn down everything he built for a future still uncertain. She asked him what he wanted, really wanted, and he answered not with promises or poetry, but with clarity. "I want to be a father. I want to be there for every missed birthday, every hard conversation, every science project, every moment I should have had, and still can if you'll let me." The next day, headlines exploded again, this time with stories of Grant Sinclair withdrawing from the Sinclair Family Trust and stepping down from several corporate positions. Critics called it reckless, analysts speculated about financial collapse, but Grant didn't flinch. He focused on Oliver, attended his first parent-teacher meeting, helped him with homework, sat beside him during doctor visits, and every night before bed read from the same finance textbook that had sparked the boy's obsession with numbers. Amelia watched from the doorway each time, heart aching, uncertain if she was witnessing a beautiful beginning or a temporary illusion. One evening, as they were finishing dinner together at a small, out-of-the-way diner, a man approached their table, unfamiliar but composed, and introduced himself as Charles Benton, a lawyer once affiliated with the Sinclair family. He asked to speak with Amelia in private, and though hesitant, she followed him outside. He explained in low tones that 10 years ago, shortly after the broken engagement, Grant had attempted to locate her through private channels, that a sealed letter had been written and never delivered, intercepted by someone close to the family, someone who believed silence was in everyone's best interest. The letter contained not just an apology, but an offer, details of a trust fund for any child resulting from that night, and instructions on how to reach him safely. The fact that it had been hidden confirmed something Amelia had long suspected, but never proved. Someone had deliberately kept them apart. When she returned to the table, her face was pale, her hands shaking slightly, and Grant immediately asked what was wrong. She handed him a business card with Charles's name and simply said, "There was a letter." That night, they sat on her balcony in silence, staring at the skyline, letting the weight of missed years settle between them like fog. Grant apologized for things beyond his control, for actions taken in ignorance, for wounds he couldn't heal with money or explanations. Amelia didn't forgive him completely. Not yet, but she softened, realizing that maybe he wasn't the villain in the story after all. As they grew closer, so did the threats from Grant's former world. Anonymous emails, veiled warnings, attempts to discredit Amelia publicly, all signs that someone wanted to erase the truth and preserve the illusion that Grant Sinclair had never strayed from the path designed for him. But Grant stood his ground, refused hush-money offers, filed lawsuits where necessary, and began preparing for a public legal battle to expose the interference from within his own circle. He knew it wouldn't be easy, knew it could cost him everything that remained of his legacy, but he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. His future was no longer defined by his name, but by the people he chose to stand beside. The final straw came when someone leaked a doctored report claiming Oliver had behavioral issues, an attempt to paint Amelia as an unfit mother and suggest Grant should seek full custody to remove the child from scandal. The story spread fast, hit major news outlets, and even reached Oliver's school, prompting a temporary suspension. Grant moved faster than anyone expected, held an emergency press conference, brought Amelia and Oliver to the stage, and declared that the real scandal was not a boy born from honesty, but a system built on deceit. He called for investigations, named those responsible, and then turned to Oliver on stage and said, "They tried to rewrite your story, but you wrote your truth, and that truth is stronger than any lie they build." That moment became the image of the year, a father, a son, and a woman who once gave everything for a man she barely knew, now standing together as a family, not because of contracts or expectations, but because they chose one another, despite the cost. Amelia looked at Grant then, truly looked at him, and for the first time since that night in Las Vegas, she saw not the boy trying to escape a marriage, but the man who had learned how to fight for what mattered. And though she said nothing out loud, her fingers slid into his as the cameras flashed, and he squeezed them gently, as if to say he would never let go again. In the days following the press conference, there was a strange quiet that settled over their lives, not because the world had moved on, but because the storm had paused, waiting, observing, deciding whether to retreat or strike again. For a while, Amelia almost believed that maybe they had reached the end of the worst, that perhaps the worst enemies had revealed themselves, that maybe all that remained was healing. Oliver returned to school with his head held high, his suspension lifted after the allegations were proven false. His classmates welcomed him back with a mixture of curiosity and admiration, and for the first time, he felt like he belonged to something more than a single-parent household held together by quiet strength. Grant, meanwhile, settled into the role of fatherhood with a mix of awe and guilt. Every moment with Oliver felt like a revelation, from simple dinners to early morning drives, from sitting beside him during spelling tests to falling asleep watching documentaries about the stock market. He didn't try to fix what was lost. Instead, he focused on what he could still build, on the fragments of trust that grew stronger each time Oliver laughed in his presence or leaned into his shoulder without hesitation. Amelia watched this from a careful distance, her guard never fully lowered, though part of her began to believe that maybe redemption wasn't just a word for fiction. But peace, she had learned, was often the beginning of a deeper unraveling. One afternoon, while Grant was in a meeting and Oliver was at school, Amelia received an envelope delivered by hand. No return address, just her name written in clean, sharp cursive. Inside was a photograph, a printed surveillance still showing Oliver standing outside the school gate with a man she didn't recognize, a tall figure in a dark coat, one hand resting casually on the boy's backpack. The second image showed them walking down the sidewalk. No alarm, no struggle, but something about the man's posture made her blood run cold. Alongside the photo was a typed note, short and cruel. "The truth has a price. Some families protect what's theirs." Amelia dropped the letter, her heart slamming against her chest in panic as she grabbed her phone, called the school, confirmed Oliver was still inside, safe, unaware. She then called Grant, her voice tight with fear, and within the hour their entire security team had been activated, the school placed on alert, cameras checked, threats analyzed. The photos were traced to a traffic surveillance feed from 2 days earlier, which meant whoever sent them had access to systems most civilians couldn't touch. Grant knew immediately that this wasn't random. This was orchestrated, intentional, meant not just to intimidate but to send a message, and he had a terrifying suspicion about where it came from. He confronted his father that evening, not in a boardroom but in the Sinclair family estate, a place he had once called home and now saw only as a fortress built on generations of manipulation. Richard didn't deny the implication, didn't flinch when Grant threw the photos onto the polished mahogany table, just stared at them with calculated calm and said, "You're endangering the name we built because you can't let go of a mistake." That word, mistake, ignited something in Grant he hadn't felt since he was a boy, not anger, but clarity, the realization that love would always be a threat to people who only understood power. Grant told his father that if anything ever happened to Oliver or Amelia, if he even suspected their safety had been compromised by anyone within the Sinclair circle, he would dismantle the legacy brick by brick and take every name associated with it into ruin. Richard didn't answer, didn't threaten, just said, "You'll regret this when it's too late," and turned away. Grant left that house knowing there was no returning, no more second chances, not with his family, not with the empire that had chosen its image over his humanity. But just when they thought they had seen the worst, the unthinkable happened. On a Friday morning, as Amelia waited outside Oliver's school to pick him up, her car was rammed from behind by a black SUV with tinted windows. The impact was sharp, disorienting, her head slammed against the steering wheel, and before she could reach for her phone, two masked men opened the driver's side door and dragged her out. It happened so quickly, so efficiently, that the witnesses barely registered it until she was gone. By the time the police arrived, there were no plates on the vehicle, no clues left behind, just a single piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper, with one sentence in bold block letters, "You should have stayed silent." When Grant received the call, he didn't panic outwardly, didn't scream or collapse. He went cold, efficient, dangerous. He activated every contact, private investigators, off-duty federal agents he once hired for risk assessments, security techs, trackers. And within hours, a citywide search began. Oliver, who was rushed to safety with the help of Grant's team, sat silently in a private room, his small hands clenched into fists, refusing to speak until Grant knelt in front of him and promised, "I will bring her home." The boy looked into his father's eyes and said with steady resolve, "She's strong, but she needs you now." Over the next 36 hours, the investigation uncovered a location on the outskirts of the city, an abandoned warehouse with signs of recent activity. Grant didn't wait for official clearance. He went with his team in the dead of night, a bulletproof vest under his coat and rage pulsing through his veins. Inside, they found Amelia tied to a chair, bruised but conscious, her eyes lighting up the moment she saw him. He ran to her, untying the ropes, whispering her name over and over like a prayer, and when she leaned into his arms, trembling, he realized just how close he had come to losing everything again. Later, after the police arrested 3 men with links to a private security firm once employed by the Sinclair family, Grant held a press conference with Amelia beside him, not to protect his name, but to make it clear that anyone who dared touch his family again would be exposed, legally, financially, publicly. The cameras captured a man transformed, not just a billionaire, not just a father, but someone who had finally chosen love over legacy. The crowd watched in silence as he turned to Amelia, took her hand and said, 10 years ago, I didn't fight for you because I was afraid of losing everything. Now, I know that losing you is." That night, they sat together in the quiet of their home, Oliver asleep between them, the past still echoing in the walls, the scars still fresh, but the future finally visible. Amelia looked at Grant, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd come for me." He answered without hesitation, "I didn't think I could breathe if I didn't." And in that stillness, in that breath held between what almost was and what finally became, something changed. Not just the way they looked at each other, but the way they understood what it meant to choose one another after everything had been taken and still want to stay. They had lost time, lost trust, almost lost their lives. But what remained was not broken. It was rebuilt, and it 1 year later, the world had moved on from the headlines. The noise had faded into the background, and the people who once speculated about their lives had turned their attention to newer scandals, fresher gossip, louder distractions. But for Amelia, Grant, and Oliver, the real story had only just begun. Not the version told in newspapers or interviews, but the quiet, intimate version built through shared mornings, late-night laughter, and the kind of trust that only grows through surviving what should have broken them. They lived in a house nestled in the hills outside San Francisco, far from the corporate towers that once defined Grant's existence, a place where Oliver had space to run, where the trees swayed gently in the evening wind, and where silence no longer felt like absence, but like peace. Grant no longer wore suits every day, his voice on the phone softer, his days no longer dictated by shareholder expectations but by soccer games, parent-teacher meetings, and learning how to cook breakfast without burning the toast. He still worked, of course. Passion didn't disappear just because priorities changed. But now he worked on projects that meant something: investments in education, support for single-parent families, mentorship programs for kids like Oliver who just needed someone to see them. Amelia returned to her love of books, accepted a position as a literacy coordinator at a local nonprofit, and spent her afternoons surrounded by stories, her evenings wrapped in arms that now held her without hesitation. She no longer flinched when the past crept into conversation, no longer wondered if she would be left behind again, because every single day Grant showed up, not just for her, but for the life they had created out of so much pain. And Oliver, growing taller each month, thrived in the kind of stability he had once only seen in movies. He smiled more, laughed freely, and when asked about his parents, he simply said, "They found their way back to each other. That's all you need to know." The day of the wedding came with no extravagance, no grand stage, just a quiet ceremony in the backyard, beneath a canopy of soft lights and gentle music. Oliver stood between them as they exchanged vows, holding both their hands as if anchoring them to the present. There were no rehearsed speeches, just honest words spoken through emotion. And when Grant looked into Amelia's eyes and said, "I didn't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life earning it," she answered with tears in her eyes, "You already have, by never walking away again." They danced barefoot on the grass, under the stars, the sound of laughter and music floating into the night, and for once there were no photographers, no news cameras, just friends, family, and the soft hum of happiness that didn't need to be documented to be real. Later that night, when Oliver asked if they would always stay like this, if nothing would ever pull them apart again, Amelia pulled him close and said, "Love doesn't promise an easy life, but real love keeps showing up, even after everything." Grant placed a hand on her back, smiled at their son, and added, "Especially after everything," he said. And so, the woman who once gave away her virginity not for romance but for mercy, who carried the weight of sacrifice in silence for years, finally stood in the light of a love that had been tested by time and found its way home. Because sometimes, the strongest stories aren't the ones written in bold headlines, they're the quiet ones, told in the way two people choose each other again and again, no matter how far they've had to come to get there. Sometimes, the heart remembers what the world forgets, and love, when it's real, always finds its way back.